to J-Town Brew Co. Let's brew some beer. So beer is made up of water, malted barley, hops, and yeast. Very simple, been made for millennium. A lot of people are daunted by getting into this hobby, making their own beer, but really there's nothing to fear. The ancients did it, you can do it too. So what is brewing beer? Well, first you have the mash. That's when you add the barley into the hot water and you get all the nice sugary beer water, the wort, out of it. Then you have the boil where you add the hops. That's the bittering part, so it's not too sweet. And then you cool it down and you add the yeast. That's the fermentation. After that, you have beer. Simple as that. So what we have today is an Irish Red Ale from Northern Brewer. This is one of their easy kits. This kit I got for less than 25 bucks, I want to say. They have great deals, so you can check them out. This is a few things that you are going to need, though, if you want to do brewing on your own. Star San, this is a food-grade acid sanitizer. You're going to need that to keep your beer healthy, to sanitize your fermentation device. This could be optional, but if you'd like to know what the alcohol percentages of your beer, you could use this as a hydrometer, and we'll talk about that later. This is a small digital scale to help you figure out how much hops by volume or weight you should add, or even specialty grains. And then a digital thermometer. That way we can test the temperature of our wort during the mash, and also test the temperature of our finished product before we pitch the yeast to make sure that we don't kill it. So let's get started. What we're going to do is add the water into the mash tun, get it heated up, and we'll mill our grain. So what I have here is just a basic chlorine filter. The water that I have is balanced and it's good water. If your water is a little hard or soft, you might want to look into filtering it a certain way to make sure that it's balanced water. Now what I'm going to do is fill my mash tun with water, which is the strike water to heat to add my barley to once I've milled it. Now what I'm filling it with is with hot water, right from my hot water heater. So it'll shave a little time for us. So I've added the strike water, that's just the water that I'm preparing for the mash, into my mash tun. Now you don't have to have something like this in order to get started in brewing. You can just use a regular pot on the stove. And you don't have to make 5 gallons at a time. You can start with 1 gallon. You just change your recipe according to that size. What I'm doing is I'm letting it warm up to my mash temperature, right? But a little bit higher than that. When I add grain that's cold, it's going to lower the temperature of my water. Now there is calculators for that. I'll add them in the description of the video, but you want to make sure when you add how many ever pounds of grain into your strike water, that when it brings that temperature down, it brings it to the temperature that you want, which is usually somewhere around 155 degrees. For this recipe, it's 153 degrees. So according to the calculator, which I'll include in the comments, in the description, it'll tell you according to how much pounds of malted barley you have, how much water you should use, and what the temperature should be when you add the grains. Now what we're going to be doing is a type of brew in a bag brewing, and what that means is we're going to heat the water, we're going to put a container essentially into here that's going to hold those grains, so that when it's done and all those nice sugary water, that wort is done, we can actually lift the grain out and let that wort go through the grain bed and into our container. There's different systems for doing this, but we want to remove that spent grain after the sugar's gone and all the flavors out and away. So you can do that with a large cheesecloth if you only have, say, a 1 gallon pot, or you can buy brew in a bag, or BIAB bags for a larger pot, like a 5 gallon pot. Next we're going to be milling our grain. So I'm about to mill the grain. You don't have to have a mill to be able to do this. You can actually order the grain already milled. So no worries on this. You can get this later. So we're adding the milled grain to our heated strike water. And you want to do this a little at a time. That way you can stir it in and make sure you don't get a lot of clumped up grain. That creates dough balls, and then you don't get the good sugary goodness out of it for your wort. You want every bit of flavor you can get, and every bit of sugar you can get, because sugar turns into alcohol. So once we get this nice and mixed in here, what we're going to do is make sure it's setting at our mash temperature according to our recipe with no dough balls. And we're going to let it sit for an hour or 60 minutes. That's the usual time for a 5-gallon batch. Through the magic of YouTube, it's been an hour. The mash is done, so hopefully all those delicious sugars are now part of our wort. And what we're going to do is take the grains and remove them from the wort. And then we're going to heat this up to a boil. And that's when we add our hops. So with this system, we talked about before you could have brew in a bag. But what this is the metal version of that. It's like a strainer. So when I lift this out, that wort is going to drain through, leaving the grain behind. If you had a bag, then you'd be lifting the bag, the grain would stay within it, and that nice wort would come through it and out. Now what we are going to need to do is add more water, and that's called sparge water. Your recipe will tell you what temperature that needs to be at to add to your grain bed. Can it be colder than that temperature if you don't have the ability to heat it? Yes, it can. It could change the flavor of the beer slightly. Probably won't recognize it in the finished product. So the reason we do that is it gets the extra sugars in that grain bed out, so that we have a more full-bodied beer. And also we want to raise the volume to our boil volume. And what that means is when we boil this, we'll have evaporation. So we want to make sure that our finished volume after that boil, which is usually an hour, will be to the level that we need for our finished product. So in this case, I want 5 gallons of finished beer. So I want to bring my boil volume to 6 gallons, because I know that I will boil up a half a gallon just about per hour, and that will leave me with 5.5 gallons. So once it's done fermenting and the yeast and the different things, the sediments fall to the bottom and that is wasted away, I will be left with a finished product of 5 gallons. So while this is going, we'll talk about the hydrometer. So now we're going to use our hydrometer, and at this point what we can do is take a little bit of our wort and we're going to need to cool it. So I'll take the wort, and now I'll need to cool it for our hydrometer. The hydrometer reads the specific gravity of our wort. So that can tell us how much sugar content is within it, which in turn will tell us how much alcohol we can get out of it. Now with your hydrometer, these are calibrated to a specific temperature. This one is actually calibrated to 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Right now, we were just mashing at 150, 155 degrees. So I'm going to need to cool this in the freezer and check it with my thermometer to make sure it's 60 degrees before I can get an accurate reading of what my sugar percentage or my possible alcohol percentage could be. So for time's sake, we'll say I cooled this down to 60 degrees, which my hydrometer has been calibrated to, and what I will do is I'll take it and I will set it into my wort. Now that will float at a specific gravity. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to read it where the meniscus or where the line of the fluid meets the carafe to the reading on the hydrometer itself, and I will mark that down as my starting specific gravity. Now, some hydrometers give you a basic idea of what your alcohol percentage will be without having to use a calculator, which is nice. So this one on the start will probably be somewhere around 5%, and that's what my recipe says that it should be. So I write that down and I save it, because once this wort is then fermented, I'll do the same thing. I'll put my hydrometer in, I'll see what my ending reading is, and then I take those two numbers with my ABV calculator or my alcohol by volume calculator, and it will tell me exactly the alcohol percentage that I got. What that does is it tells me how efficient my mash is, and maybe if I could make things better to make more of an alcohol content, especially as it relates to the recipe and how that should be. So our next step then will be to sparge and then to boil. Little tip, you really don't need this. When you're making beer, the great thing about it is when you're done, it's going to be beer and your friends are still going to love it. And you're still going to like it because you made it. So this is something you don't really need. And if you don't have it, don't be worried. You're still making beer. Have fun. So what I'm doing here is I'm adding the heated sparge water to this to raise that volume, get all the nice sugars through the grain bed. If you have hot water, it should be at a specific temperature, usually in the 170s. Do you have to do it at that temperature? No. For a small batch beers, is it that crazy of a difference? Probably not going to be able to tell. The main thing at this point is to get the sugars through the grain bed and get that wort up to your appropriate boil volume level. Next step is the boil and the hop addition. So we've gotten our desired volume. So now I'm going to take this, which is the spent grain, and take it off and allow this to boil. So this is the equivalent of that bag we were talking about, the brew in the bag. Inside here is the spent grain. A great way to know how efficient you were as a guesstimation is just to take a little bit of the grain, put it on your tongue. If it's real sweet, that's a bad sign. You want the sweetness in there in the wort. If it's not sweet at all, maybe even tart, you did a good job. You have an efficient mash. This is not very sweet at all, so I know all the sugar, or at least as much as I could get, is actually in the wort, which means alcohol. We're at a boil here, so when we add our hops is when usually we start the time. Now, timing for a recipe is from an hour countdown. So it starts at 60 minutes with a 5-gallon batch, or even with a 1-gallon batch, according to the recipe, and it counts down from that. So it could be a little confusing because it starts at 60 minutes and goes down. So what that means is your first hop addition, okay? It will say your hop and 60 minutes. The next one could say the hop name and then 20 minutes. That means 20 minutes left, okay? If it says the hop name and then 10 minutes, that means 10 minutes left. So that's what could be a little confusing about that, is it's a countdown, not a count up. So when you're looking at your hop additions, remember it's a countdown. It's how many minutes left of the boil. So for this, we're going to be adding our hops to the start of the boil, 60 minutes. That's the start of the boil. Now, why that's important is because the more hops is boiling in the wort, the more bitter it will be. The less time that is boiling in the wort, the more aroma there will be. So depending on how you're adding your hops is how bitter or aromatic your beer will be. So now that we are boiling, I'm going to add my hops, which I have set up by weight with my scale, and we're going to add that into the boil. So now that I've added that, that's a 60-minute hop. My 60 minutes is starting right now. So this is the spent grain that we use to make the wort. So all the sugar hopefully has been removed from it. Now what can we do with this? Well, maybe we could upcycle. We could give this to someone that has chickens and they could feed the chickens with it, maybe trade for some eggs. Some people actually make muffins or types of bread with it. It's up to you. If all else fails, throw it out, no big deal. So there's usually at least two hops in a beer, the bittering hops and the aromatic hops. I've already added the bittering hops, which goes in at the beginning of the boil. And now I'm going to add my aromatic hops, which in this case is UK Goldings. So I've already gotten the correct amount, and I'm going to add it to my wort. Now before I didn't show you, but I'll show you now, I actually have a filter that I boil the hops in so it doesn't become part of the wort. And that just is easier for the finished beer because it won't have the hop material in it. It'll be caught within this filter, and I'll just have the bittered beer as I'd like it as the finished product. So now I'll add that into my filter. Again, this was the 20-minute edition, so 20 minutes left to the boil, not 20 minutes into the boil. So again, your hop addition, the timing, is how much is left to the boil. So if it's 30 minutes, 30 minutes left. If it's 20 minutes, 20 minutes left to the boil. If it's 10 minutes, 10 minutes left to the boil. Now we're going to talk about sanitation. Up until this point, you really didn't need to sanitize anything because we're going to boil it. Obviously, you want it clean, right? So you want all your equipment clean, washed clean. But up until this point is when we actually sanitize. That's when we're using the Star San or some other food grade sanitizer. So what I've done is I've mixed some already in the appropriate amount into here. So I'll use this to sanitize. So what am I sanitizing? Well, I'm going to sanitize my cooling equipment. So in this case, I have a plate chiller, really just for size. Different chillers actually go into the wort and chill. So if it's a type of chiller that goes into the wort to chill it, then you're going to want to sanitize it just by putting it in there clean and letting it boil at least for 10 minutes inside the wort. That'll sanitize it, and then you can use it to chill. Now the one kind that go inside to chill the wort uses a cool water to run through it, and you'd hook it up the same way essentially this is to chill it. This is just a smaller condensed package. So our chiller and then our tubing. So the wort's going to come from here through a small pump. It's going to pump it through our chiller, which has cool water coming through it, and the cool water will chill our wort down to an appropriate temperature for us to be able to pitch the yeast. So what I'm doing here is I'm just sanitizing my plate chiller and my pump. The pump is actually a submergible pump inside of the sanitizer, and it's just recirculating the sanitizer for at least a couple minutes to make sure everything is clean. We don't want any of those bag bugs to sour our beer. Now when I hook this up, I'm going to have the inlet of the wort, the hot wort, coming in here and coming out here into my fermentation device. You want to make sure that when you're using a chill plate that the inlet of the cold water is opposite to the inlet of the hot wort, because you want it to cross to get the best chilling that you can. Next step, we'll hook this up and we'll put our chilled wort into our fermentation device. So now our wort is done, the boil is over, we're going to cool it and we're going to transfer it into our fermentation vessel. Okay? So for a fermentation vessel, it needs to be something that's food grade. You have to make sure it's airtight, because when they pitch the yeast, it's going to expel CO2, and we want it to only expel CO2 and not let any oxygen in. Oxygen allows bacteria to grow. Now, say you're doing this for the first time, you're using a pot, brew in a bag style, you don't have to have all the stuff. Once you're done with the boil, you could take that pot and you could put it into a refrigerator, or you could put it on ice to cool it down to the fermentation temperature where you can pitch the yeast. Just make sure if you're going to do that without some kind of a plate or a chiller of some sort, that you need to make sure it's clean. So you can clean the top and cover it and put it on ice or whatever it may be, but make sure no bacteria can get into that. We have our finished wort inside of a keg. We're going to ferment it in here. The reason being is the fermenter I'm usually using already has another IPA fermenting inside. So because I need space, I'm going to be using this. Now, before I pitch my yeast, I used my thermometer, I checked the temperature, and I made sure it was at least less than 90 degrees. Otherwise, you have a good chance of killing your yeast. When I pitched my yeast, I also put Clarity Ferment from White Labs, and that's because this also reduces the gluten to where it's essentially gluten-free, so that if you have any friends that have a gluten intolerance, they'll be able to drink your beer as well, or if you do. So this has to be pitched the same time as the yeast. And you want to make sure, again, that it's less than 90 degrees when you do so. So because this is inside of a corny keg and it's going to ferment, what I did was I used the gas side of the corny keg. This would be the beer side. That's where the beer would come out from when you put pressure on the keg. I'm using the gas side to hook up my bubbler. Now, any fermentation device that you use, you want it to be airtight and you want to use a bubbler. Otherwise, it could explode. So with the bubbler, you use some mixed sanitizer that you had before inside here. And once this has stopped bubbling, you got beer. Hope you enjoyed the video. We made our first beer here. Spent grain means we got beer coming. So stay tuned for our next video on how to keg and bottle your finished product. Hope you enjoyed it.